The room went silent the moment Arthur Vance stood, his voice slicing through the air like a verdict. In front of him was Ilara, a girl with dirt under her nails, grief in her chest, and the last hope of her mother's legacy trembling at the edge of collapse. He called her collateral damage, 2 words cold enough to freeze the entire town hall. But what he didn't know was that the girl he tried to crush was carrying a secret powerful enough to shatter his empire. A truth buried for decades, a truth tied to a simple silver locket and to the one person Arthur Vance had spent his whole life trying to forget. By the time he realized who she really was, it was already too late. The fight for her flower shop was only the beginning, and the next move was hers. In a room filled with nervous whispers and the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, a man whose name was synonymous with power looked down at a young woman who had nothing but the dirt under her fingernails and a desperate plea in her eyes. He was Arthur Vance, a titan of real estate, a man whose personal fortune was a staggering collection of stocks, bonds, and global assets that could swallow her entire world without a trace. She was Ilara, and her world was a small, struggling flower shop on a corner he had already decided to erase. With the entire town watching, he leaned into the microphone, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. "Progress," he said, his gaze sweeping over her worn-out cardigan, "has little time for sentiment or for collateral damage." The words, cold and sharp, hung in the air, a public execution of her last sliver of hope. But to understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand what that little shop meant. It wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary. The only real home Ilara had ever known. She had inherited the blooming stem from Martha, the woman who had adopted her as a baby and raised her with a gentle hand and a love for all things that grow. The shop was a living memory of Martha's kindness. Its air was thick with the scent of damp earth, fresh-cut roses, and the faint, sweet perfume of lilies. The wooden floors were scuffed and worn from decades of customers, and the countertops were stained with water rings and pollen, each mark a testament to a life lived among beauty. For Ilara, this place was her entire inheritance, not of money, but of love. Her life was a quiet war fought on 2 fronts. By day, she battled wilting inventory and dwindling customers, her hands constantly moving, trimming stems, arranging bouquets, her mind a frantic calculator of bills versus earnings. By night, she fought the crushing loneliness and the quiet fear that this life, this constant struggle, was all there would ever be. She possessed a remarkable artistic talent, a gift for capturing the soul of a flower with a charcoal pencil on scrap paper. But her art was a luxury she couldn't afford. The sketches were tucked away, forgotten dreams in a world that demanded rent and utility payments in cold, hard dollars. Hope was a fragile bloom she struggled to keep alive, a foolish little weed pushing its way through the cracks of her reality. Then the letter arrived. It was a cold, formal document in a crisp envelope, its legalese a stark contrast to the gentle chaos of her shop. Foreclosure notice. The words were clinical, brutal. The bank, under pressure from Vance's Development Corporation, was calling in the loan. The shop, her home, her last connection to Martha, would be sold at public auction in exactly 1 month. The paper felt heavy in her hand, a death sentence for the only life she knew. Arthur Vance wasn't just buying a property, he was bulldozing her past and her future to make way for a sterile tower of glass and steel, another jewel in the crown of his vast real estate empire. Arthur Vance saw the city as his personal chessboard. Each block was a square to be conquered, each old building a pawn to be sacrificed for a more powerful piece. He was a man hardened by a private tragedy he never spoke of, a sorrow that had calcified his heart and left him with a singular focus, building a legacy of concrete and capital. His wealth was legendary, a modern-day dynasty built on aggressive investments and an almost psychic ability to predict the ebb and flow of the stock market. He moved through the world, insulated by his immense power, seeing people not as individuals, but as figures on a balance sheet, either assets or liabilities. Ilara and her little flower shop were, to him, a minor liability, an inconvenience to be swept aside. That's what brought her to the town hall meeting, terrified but resolute. She stood before the planning commission and the assembled crowd, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper with her notes. Her voice, when it came, was small but clear. She didn't talk about profit margins or property values. She spoke of Mrs. Gable, who bought a single daisy every Tuesday to put on her late husband's grave. She spoke of the young couple who met in her shop and came back every year on their anniversary. She spoke of a community, a neighborhood, a place where roots ran deeper than the foundations of any skyscraper. She was pleading not just for her business, but for the soul of her street. And that was when Arthur Vance rose to speak. He didn't address the commission. He addressed her. He dismantled her heartfelt plea with the cold precision of a surgeon. He spoke of economic growth, of tax revenue, of a future that had no room for nostalgic little shops. He pointed out the scuff on her shoes, the frayed hem of her sleeve, as if her poverty was proof of her irrelevance. And then came the final, devastating blow, collateral damage. He dismissed her life, her mother's legacy, with 2 words. The silence in the room was deafening. Humiliation washed over Ilara, hot and suffocating. She saw the pity in some faces, the discomfort in others, but in Arthur Vance's eyes, she saw nothing at all. It was this chilling indifference, more than the insult itself, that changed everything. As she walked out of that hall, the shame began to cool, hardening into something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The unshakable resolve to fight back. That resolve didn't feel like a fire. It was a cold, hard stone forming in the pit of her stomach. Back in the quiet solitude of her shop, surrounded by the gentle, sleeping faces of flowers, the public humiliation replayed in her mind. But now, it wasn't the sting of his words she felt, but the icy calm of his eyes. He had looked right through her as if she were a ghost already. And in that moment, Ilara decided that if she was going to be collateral damage, she would be the most troublesome, inconvenient, and memorable collateral damage Arthur Vance had ever encountered. She couldn't fight him with money. Her entire net worth was tied up in wilting peonies and the worn-out cash register. She couldn't fight him with lawyers. The only legal document she could afford was the foreclosure notice itself. But she had something he could never buy: her hands, her heart, and the artistic talent she had buried under years of practicality. Late that night, she pulled out a dusty portfolio from beneath her small bed in the back room. Inside were sketches she hadn't looked at in years, charcoal drawings of intricate petals, the delicate curve of a stem, the faces of customers caught in moments of joy or sorrow. Her art was the only voice she had left. With trembling fingers, she sharpened a piece of charcoal. She wouldn't just write words on a poster, she would show them what they were losing. Her first drawing wasn't of the shop, but of Mrs. Gable's wrinkled hand placing a single daisy on a headstone. The next was of the young couple, their faces illuminated by the glow of the shop's window, their hands clasped over a bouquet of roses. She drew the baker next door, his flower-dusted apron and warm smile. Around the border of each poster, she drew a unique, stylized flower, a blossom with 5 teardrop-shaped petals and a delicate, swirling center. It was a design she had doodled since childhood, a flower that existed only in her imagination, a symbol of a beauty that couldn't be bought or sold. Under the cloak of darkness, she moved through the silent streets, a phantom armed with tape and paper. She placed the posters on lampposts, in the windows of sympathetic neighboring businesses, and on the community notice board right outside the town hall. Each one was a quiet rebellion, a piece of her soul pushed out into the world. When the sun rose, the street began to wake up to her art. People stopped. They didn't just glance. They stared. They saw themselves. They saw their neighbors. They saw the heart of their community captured in stark black and white. A murmur started, a small current of support that grew throughout the day. Someone took a picture and posted it online. A local blogger wrote a short piece about the flower girl's fight. For the first time in a month, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in Ilara's chest. This small victory, however, did not go unnoticed. Miles away, in a sprawling mansion that overlooked the city like a predator from its perch, a woman named Beatrice Vance scrolled through her tablet. She wasn't Arthur's first wife, but she was his most strategic. Beatrice's life was a masterpiece of careful curation. Her marriage to Arthur was the ultimate investment, a merger that had secured her social standing and a future for her son, Julian, that was paved with gold and guaranteed by his father's immense fortune. She saw the picture of Ilara's poster, the raw emotion in the drawing, and felt a cold knot of dread. This wasn't about a flower shop. It was about a narrative. And in her world, controlling the narrative was everything. A sob story, a David versus Goliath tale could tarnish the Vance name, complicate the deal, and, in a worst-case scenario, draw unwanted attention to Arthur's past, a past she knew was best left buried. Beatrice didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw her tablet. She simply made a series of quiet phone calls. Her voice was smooth as silk, dripping with feigned concern. To one business owner, she was an anonymous, concerned citizen, whispering that the flower girl was trying to extort money from the developer. To another, she hinted that Ilara had a history of causing trouble, of being unstable. It was a subtle, venomous campaign, planting seeds of doubt that she knew would fester in the fertile ground of gossip and fear. She was protecting her assets, her son's inheritance, and the carefully constructed empire of wealth she called a family. Meanwhile, an elderly man named Alistair Finch paused in front of the blooming stem, his Friday morning routine interrupted. He was a quiet lawyer with a small, unassuming practice, a man who had been buying a small bouquet of carnations for his late wife's photo every week for the past 15 years. He saw Ilara's poster taped to her own window. He read the plea, but his eyes, trained by a lifetime of noticing details others missed, were fixed on the floral border. That design. It was so specific, so unusual. It stirred something deep within him, a memory from a lifetime ago. He was a young, idealistic lawyer back then, handling a sad, confidential adoption case. A terrified young woman, an artist, had given up her baby girl. He remembered her sketches, the way she drew that same unique 5-petaled flower on everything. It was her signature. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, a coincidence, surely. But as he walked away, the image of the flower remained burned in his mind, a key to a door he thought had been locked forever. The lawyer's unease was a stubborn ghost, following him back to his quiet office. He pulled a dusty box from the back of a filing cabinet. The label faded with age, pro bono, adoptions. His hands, wrinkled and slow, sifted through old manila folders, the paper brittle and yellowed. He told himself he was just satisfying a professional curiosity, but a deeper instinct was at work, a sense that this was more than just a coincidence. The memory of the young artist, her sad eyes, and the constant sketching of that unique flower was too vivid to ignore. Meanwhile, Ilara's quiet rebellion was blossoming. The posters had struck a chord. People started dropping by the shop, not just to buy flowers, but to offer a kind word, to press a crumpled $5 or $10 bill into her hand. The baker from next door started a donation jar on his counter, a Save the Blooming Stem online fundraiser, started by the local blogger, began to gather a small but steady stream of support. It wasn't a fortune, just a few $100s here and there, but to Ilara, it was a lifeline. It was proof that she wasn't invisible, that her fight for this small corner of the world mattered. The small pile of cash, kept in a metal box under her bed, was more than just money. It was the physical manifestation of her community's heart. Beatrice Vance watched this unfold with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing bacteria in a petri dish. She saw the online fundraiser, the growing number of positive comments, and recognized the danger immediately. Public sentiment was a volatile asset, one that could swing wildly and affect the stock prices of her husband's publicly traded companies. A protracted, messy public fight over a flower shop could damage the Vance brand, which was meticulously polished to project an image of philanthropic progress, not heartless destruction. This wasn't just about protecting her son Julian's future inheritance. It was about protecting the entire infrastructure of their wealth, the vast portfolio of assets and investments that guaranteed their lifestyle. Her next move was executed with surgical precision, using a disposable phone. She made an anonymous call to the city's Department of Health. Her voice was a mask of civic concern as she described a fabricated list of horrors: a supposed rodent infestation at the blooming stem, improper disposal of waste, mold growing in the back room. She painted a picture of a business that was a clear and present danger to public health. 2 days later, 2 city officials in crisp uniforms walked into Ilara's shop. They were polite but firm, their clipboards a shield against her confused questions. They inspected every corner, their faces impassive. They pointed to a small patch of dampness on the old cellar wall and called it potential for hazardous mold growth. They noted the lack of a modern 3-compartment sink required by a new, obscure city ordinance. Within an hour, they had taped a bright orange notice to her front door: closed by order of the Department of Health. The fines were staggering, designed to be punitive. To even begin the process of appealing, she had to pay them in full. The small fund, the community's collective hope, was wiped out in a single transaction at a city payment window. Every dollar, every act of kindness was gone. The shop was dark, the door locked, and Ilara was left with nothing but the suffocating weight of defeat. Desperation is a cold, sharp-edged thing. With the auction date looming and her income cut off, Ilara swallowed her pride and took the only job she could find on such short notice: a cleaner for a high-end catering company. The work was grueling and anonymous. She scrubbed pots, polished silverware, and mopped floors. Her hands, once skilled at arranging delicate petals, now raw and chapped from harsh chemicals. And then came the assignment that felt like a cruel joke from the universe: a massive gala, the social event of the season, to be held at the private residence of Mr. Arthur Vance. Stepping into the Vance mansion was like stepping into another world. Marble floors gleamed under the light of colossal crystal chandeliers. Priceless art adorned the walls. It was a monument to a level of wealth she couldn't even comprehend, a staggering display of capital that made her fight for her little shop seem pathetic and small. Hidden in the shadows of the service hallways, she worked silently, a ghost amidst the opulence. It was then that she overheard them. Beatrice and her son, Julian, stood in an alcove, their voices low and tense. "You must be careful," Beatrice murmured, adjusting his tie. "Your father has a history. There are skeletons, and with a fortune this large, you can't afford any surprises. This inheritance must be protected at all costs." Julian nodded, his face a mask of bored entitlement. The words were cryptic, but they sent a chill down Ilara's spine. Later, as she carried a heavy tray of used glasses back to the kitchen, she rounded a corner too quickly and bumped squarely into a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Glasses shattered on the marble floor. She looked up into the cold, familiar eyes of Arthur Vance. He didn't recognize her. He saw only a clumsy servant. "Watch where you're going, you idiot," he snarled, disgust twisting his features. "Do you have any idea what these suits cost?" Tears of shame and anger burned her eyes. She mumbled an apology and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. As she ran, a thin silver chain around her neck caught on the edge of the tray and snapped. A small, worn silver locket, her most precious possession, the only thing she had from her birth mother, fell silently onto the gleaming floor, spinning to a stop under a gilded table, completely unnoticed. The party wound down, the last of the glittering guests departing into the night, leaving behind a cavern of echoing silence and the faint scent of expensive perfume. Arthur Vance stood alone in the grand ballroom, the chaos of the evening replaced by the familiar quiet of his own thoughts. He was a man who thrived in solitude, a space where he could calculate the next move, analyze the stock market, and tally the ever-growing numbers of his net worth. His mind was a fortress of figures, a bastion against the messy unpredictability of human emotion. As the catering staff moved like specters through the rooms, cleaning up the remnants of the celebration, Arthur walked towards his study. His eyes, accustomed to scanning financial reports for the smallest discrepancy, caught a glint of something on the marble floor, half hidden in the shadow of a console table. He bent down, his joints protesting slightly, and picked it up. It was a cheap silver locket on a broken chain. Light and insignificant in his hand, it was probably worth less than the cost of the single olive in one of the martinis served that night. He assumed it belonged to one of the cleaners, the clumsy girl perhaps. His first instinct was to have it thrown away with the rest of the trash, but as he turned it over in his palm, his thumb brushed against an engraving on its surface. He stopped, his breath caught in his throat. It was a flower, a unique blossom with 5 teardrop-shaped petals and a delicately swirling center, a design that hadn't been created by a jeweler, but by his own hand, decades ago, sketched on a napkin in a small cafe for a woman with eyes the color of a summer sky. Her name was Lilia. She was an artist, his first and only true love, the one part of his past that his immense fortune could never buy back or erase. He believed he had lost her, and their unborn child. In a tragedy he had never allowed himself to fully mourn. The cold metal seemed to burn his skin. The carefully constructed walls around his heart trembled. For a dizzying second, the billionaire was gone, replaced by the young man who had promised Lilia the world. He shook his head, a harsh, involuntary motion. It was impossible, a coincidence, a cruel trick of the light and a tired mind. Designs get copied, ideas are shared. He was a man who dealt in facts and data, not in ghosts and sentiment. He shoved the locket into his trouser pocket, the sharp edges pressing against his thigh, a painful, physical reminder of a memory he had tried to bury under a mountain of gold and concrete. Miles away, in an office cluttered with the paper ghosts of 1,000 past lives, Alistair Finch finally found it. Tucked away in the back of the adoption file was a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. Written across the front in a graceful, artistic script were the words, "For my daughter, on her 21st birthday." A wave of shame washed over Alistair. That birthday had come and gone nearly 5 years ago. He had lost track of the child, a professional failing that now felt like a profound personal one. With trembling hands, he read his own notes from the case file. The details came flooding back. The young mother, Lilia, terrified of her lover's powerful and controlling family, the secret adoption arranged to protect the baby, and the name of the father, a young, fiercely ambitious man named Arthur Vance. The truth hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. The girl with the charcoal sketches and the heartbreaking plea at the town hall was the lost daughter of the very man set on destroying her. The next morning, armed with a truth that felt both righteous and dangerous, Alistair attempted to contact Arthur Vance. He was stonewalled by a series of executive assistants, his requests for a meeting about a deeply personal matter politely but firmly denied. But his message had been flagged. Beatrice Vance, who monitored her husband's affairs with the vigilance of a hawk, saw the lawyer's name and the reference to the past. She knew all about Lelia. She had made it her business to know every skeleton in Arthur's closet. She intercepted. She met Alistair not in an office, but on a windswept public plaza, the glass towers of the financial district looming over them like indifferent gods. She was gracious, her smile a perfectly polished weapon, but her eyes were cold. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice smooth as velvet, "I understand you believe you have some information relevant to my husband. Let me save you the trouble." She laid out his ruin with chilling clarity. She spoke of their legal team, their influence, the ease with which they could dismantle his small practice, challenge his license, and bury him in litigation until his modest life savings were nothing but dust. The Vance family's capital was a weapon, and she was not afraid to use it to protect her son's inheritance. "Stay away," she concluded, the smile never leaving her face. "Consider this a kindness." Panic propelled Beatrice into action. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, embodied by an old lawyer and a poor girl in a flower shop. She drove to the blighted street, her luxury sedan looking alien against the graffiti and boarded-up windows. She found Ilara inside the dark, silent shop, methodically packing the last of Martha's things into cardboard boxes. Defeat hung in the air, thick as the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the grimy window. Beatrice entered, a vision of compassion and elegance. "My dear, I am so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. She explained that she had heard of Ilara's situation and had spoken to Arthur, convincing him to show some mercy. She offered a buyout, a check for $50,000. To Ilara, who had been fighting over a few hundred, the sum was staggering. It was an escape, a new beginning. As they spoke, Beatrice gestured animatedly, and her elbow accidentally knocked a lukewarm cup of coffee off a crate. It spilled across a small box of Ilara's most precious keepsakes. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy," Beatrice cried, rushing to help. Amid the frantic dabbing with napkins, her eyes darted searching. Her target was a small, sepia-toned photograph, its edges curled with age. It showed a young woman with a radiant smile, her face partially obscured by a stray lock of hair. It was the only picture Ilara had of her birth mother. In the chaos of the spill, as Ilara frantically tried to salvage a handful of water-damaged letters, Beatrice's manicured hand, adorned with a diamond ring that could have paid off the shop's mortgage 10 times over, deftly slipped the photograph from the pile. With a practiced, fluid motion, she palmed it and tucked it into the inner pocket of her designer coat. The entire act took less than a second. To Ilara, it was just part of the frantic cleanup. "There," Beatrice said, her voice a soothing balm of deceit. She pressed the check, now slightly damp, into Ilara's hand. $50,000. "It's not the kind of capital my husband deals in, but it should be enough for a fresh start, far away from all this unpleasantness." She gave Ilara's shoulder a final, condescending pat and swept out of the shop, leaving behind the cloying scent of her perfume and the lingering smell of stale coffee. Ilara stood frozen in the middle of the room, the check clutched in her hand. The paper felt both incredibly heavy and utterly worthless. $50,000. It was more money than she had ever seen, a sum that could erase her debts and launch a new life. But as she looked at the soggy, ruined box of her past, a profound emptiness hollowed her out. Beatrice hadn't just spilled coffee, she had desecrated a sacred space, turning precious memories into a meaningless mess. The buyout felt less like an act of mercy and more like the final, crushing blow. With the foreclosure auction now just 48 hours away, a wave of utter defeat washed over her. The fight was over. Arthur Vance had won. His immense fortune, his vast portfolio of assets, had triumphed over her small, defiant heart. She was collateral damage, just as he had said. Resigned, she let the check drift from her fingers onto a dusty countertop. There was one last thing to do, one final act of love and farewell. She had to pack away Martha's personal belongings. In the small back room, pushed against a wall, was a large cedar hope chest. It was the one thing Ilara had avoided touching. It held the remnants of Martha's own youth, old linens, a wedding dress that was never worn, dried corsages. It felt too personal, too final to open. But now she had no choice. Kneeling on the cold floor, she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and thyme filled the air. She carefully began to remove the contents, folding the yellowed lace with a reverence she didn't know she possessed. Her fingers were numb, her movements mechanical, until they brushed against something that didn't feel right. A floorboard at the bottom of the chest was loose. Her breath hitched. Prying it with her fingernails, she lifted a small, rectangular piece of wood, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Lying inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound diary. She had never seen it before. Martha had never spoken of it. With trembling hands, Ilara lifted it out. The leather was soft and worn. She sat on the floor, the world outside, the looming auction, the tainted money, the soul-crushing defeat, fading into a distant hum. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was Martha's, but younger, more fluid. The first entries were from decades ago, detailing her life as a young nurse at the city hospital. And then a new story began to unfold, a story that made Ilara's heart stop. Martha wrote of a patient, a young artist named Lilia, who had been brought in late one night, alone and terrified. Lilia was pregnant, and the father of her child was a brilliant, ambitious young man from a family of immense wealth and power, a family that considered an artist with no fortune or connections to be a stain on their legacy. They had threatened Lilia, promising to use their vast capital and influence to destroy the man she loved and take her child if she didn't disappear. Martha's diary chronicled Lilia's agonizing choice. To protect her baby from a life controlled by this ruthless family, she decided to give her up for a secret adoption. Martha, moved by the young woman's plight, had agreed to help. The diary described, in perfect, heartbreaking detail, the silver locket Lilia had placed around her newborn daughter's neck, a locket engraved with a special 5-petaled flower, a symbol of a love that had to remain a secret. And as Ilara's tears fell onto the brittle pages, she read the final, critical piece of the puzzle. The entire secret adoption, every legal document, had been handled by one person, a kind, trustworthy young lawyer named Alistair Finch. The name echoed in the dusty silence of the room, a sudden, sharp clang against the muffled despair that had filled Ilara's world. Alistair Finch, the quiet, elderly lawyer who bought carnations every Friday, the man whose kind eyes had held a flicker of something she couldn't place when he looked at her posters. It wasn't coincidence, it was a connection, a thread woven through time, waiting to be pulled. The exhaustion, the soul-deep weariness that had settled in her bones, evaporated in a rush of adrenaline. This wasn't the end. This was a beginning. Clutching the diary to her chest as if it were a living heart, Ilara scrambled to her feet. Her eyes fell on the check Beatrice Vance had left on the counter. A pale rectangle of tainted money. It was a bribe, a tool to erase her, just as her mother had been erased. With a surge of righteous anger, she snatched the check, tore it into small, satisfying pieces, and let them flutter into a trash can like bitter confetti. She had no plan, only a destination. She ran out of the shop, leaving the door unlocked. The boxes of Martha's life sitting half-packed in the gloom. The cold night air hit her face, a bracing shock that cleared her mind. The city was asleep, but she had never felt more awake. She ran through the empty streets, her footsteps echoing on the pavement. The world that had seemed so hostile and indifferent just an hour before now looked different. Every shadow, every streetlight seemed to hold a secret, a piece of the story of the mother she never knew. She reached the small, unassuming building that housed Alistair Finch's law practice. A dim light glowed from his second-story window. He was there. Without hesitating, she pressed the buzzer again and again, a frantic, desperate signal. After a long moment, the intercom crackled to life. "Who is it?" Alistair's voice was weary, laced with sleep. "It's Ilara," she said, her own voice trembling but strong. "From the flower shop. I have to talk to you. I have Martha's diary." There was a pause, then the sound of the lock buzzing open. She pushed the heavy door and climbed the creaking wooden stairs. He was waiting at the top, his face etched with a mixture of shock and a profound, bone-deep sadness. He looked from her face to the leather-bound book in her hands, and he understood. He led her into his office, a room that smelled of old paper and lemon polish, and gestured for her to sit. He didn't need to ask. He simply waited. "You knew," Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. "All this time, you knew who I was." Alistair sank into his own chair, the weight of decades of silence pressing down on him. "I'm so sorry, my dear," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I lost track of you after Martha passed. I tried to find you, but it was a closed adoption. I failed. When I saw that flower on your poster, I started looking again. I found the file." He explained everything. His attempt to contact Arthur, the chilling meeting with Beatrice, the threats against his livelihood. He described how Beatrice's strategy was to protect the Vance family's vast patrimonio, a collection of global activos and negocios so immense that a lost heir would be a catastrophic complication. He then rose and walked to an old, fireproof safe in the corner of the room. He turned the dial with a slow, deliberate click and opened the heavy door. From inside, he retrieved a single, yellowed envelope. "This is for you," he said, his hand trembling as he held it out. "Your mother, Lilia. She left it with me. Her instructions were to give it to you on your 21st birthday. I have carried the guilt of not finding you for years." Ilara took the letter. Her mother's name was written on the front in a beautiful, flowing script. With unsteady fingers, she broke the wax seal that had been untouched for over 2 decades. The letter inside was several pages long, filled with that same elegant handwriting. It was not a letter of sorrow, but of fierce, protective love. Lilia wrote of her love for Arthur, a brilliant man not yet hardened by the pursuit of his first $1 billion. She wrote of the joy she felt carrying her child, but she also wrote of the cold reality of his family, who saw her as a threat to their dynasty, a liability that could damage their carefully managed public image and dilute their son's future, FIANCÉ'S. The letter confirmed the story in the diary, but then it revealed something more. "He has one too," Lilia had written. "I made him promise a matching locket with the same flower engraved on it. He said it was the only piece of his heart he would ever give away. He keeps it hidden, a secret from the world, in the safe behind the painting in his office. It's the one place his family's influence and their obsession with lucro and rentabilidad could never touch." Ilara looked up from the page, her eyes locking with Alistair's. The locket, the one she had lost at the mansion. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was one half of a matched set, and the other half, the undeniable proof of Arthur Vance's hidden past, was sitting in his corporate headquarters. The auction for her shop, her home, was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning. A cold, clear purpose settled over her. She would not let her mother's sacrifice be in vain. She would not be collateral damage. She would face the man who was her father, not with a plea for mercy, but with a truth he could not deny. The city was just beginning to stir as they stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, and the first hints of light were silhouetting the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. One of those towers, the tallest and most severe, was their destination. Vance Tower, the heart of Arthur Vance's global empire. Alistair's old car rattled as he drove, a stark contrast to the sleek, silent luxury vehicles that would soon fill these streets. Ilara sat in the passenger seat, the diary and the letter held tightly in her lap. She wasn't the same person who had trembled at the town hall meeting. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of steel forged in the fire of truth. She was no longer fighting for a shop. She was fighting for a life that had been stolen from her, for a mother she never knew, and for the small, broken piece of the man who was her father. Vance Tower was an architectural marvel of intimidation. It rose from the pavement like a shard of black glass, reflecting the dawn sky with cold indifference. Its lobby was a cathedral of wealth, a vast, echoing space of polished granite and brushed steel. A security guard with an earpiece and an impassive face stopped them at the front desk. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he doubted it. "We have an urgent appointment with Mr. Vance," Alistair said, his voice steady and professional, the old lawyer re-emerging from the quiet man who bought carnations. He didn't flinch under the guard's skeptical gaze. After a tense phone call to an unseen office, they were issued visitor passes and directed to a private elevator. The ride up was silent and unnervingly fast, the city shrinking below them. Ilara felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if she were being pulled into a world where she didn't belong, a world built on a foundation of capital and ruthless ambition. The elevator opened directly into a reception area that was larger than her entire shop. A woman with a headset and a tight smile greeted them. "Mr. Vance is in a meeting. You can wait here." But before they could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "I'll handle this, Jessica." Beatrice Vance emerged from an adjacent office, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Ilara's annual income. She radiated a smug, triumphant energy. The auction was mere hours away, the final paperwork for the demolition already drawn up. This was her victory lap. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Ilara's worn coat and Alistair's dated suit. "I believe I made myself clear, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "And you," she added, turning to Ilara, "I gave you a very generous offer. You should have taken the dinero. We're not here to see you," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly firm. "We're here to see him." Just then, the double doors to the main office opened, and Arthur Vance strode out, followed by two men in suits who nodded respectfully and headed for the elevator. Arthur stopped when he saw them, his face hardening into a mask of annoyance. "What is the meaning of this? I thought this was settled. Get them out of here." "Arthur, please," Beatrice said, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. "They're trespassing. Let security handle it." "Mr. Vance," Alistair began, stepping forward. "My client has a legal and personal claim that requires your immediate attention." Arthur laughed, a short, humorless bark. "A claim? The girl from the flower shop has a claim? Don't waste my time. The auction proceeds as planned. This little piece of real estate is a rounding error in my portfolio of activos, but I don't tolerate loose ends." He turned his back on them, a final, brutal dismissal. "My mother's name was Lilia," Ilara said, her voice ringing out in the silent office. Arthur froze, his back still to her. The name hung in the air, a ghost summoned from the past. He turned around slowly, his face unreadable, but a new tension coiled in his shoulders. Beatrice's smile faltered, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "She was an artist," Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength as she took a step forward, holding up the diary. "She kept a journal. Her nurse, the woman who raised me, saved it." She then held up the letter. "And she wrote this for me?" Arthur stared at the items in her hand, his gaze fixed on the elegant script on the envelope. A war was raging behind his cold eyes. The billionaire, accustomed to controlling every variable, fighting against a memory he had long ago locked away. He had built a fortress of riqueza around his heart, a wall of stocks, bonds, and global investimentos, designed to keep this exact kind of pain out. "It's a trick," Beatrice hissed, her grip tightening on Arthur's arm. "A desperate attempt to extort money, to get a piece of your fortuna. Don't listen to her." He looked from Beatrice to Ilara, his mind a machine built for calculating risk and reward, trying to process this impossible variable. "Get out," he said, his voice a low growl, but it lacked the conviction of before. "Whatever scheme you've concocted, it's over." "She was terrified of your family," Ilara pressed on, her voice raw with an emotion that couldn't be faked. "Terrified their obsession with status and their patrimonio would destroy you both. So she gave me up to protect me, and to protect you." "Lies," Beatrice spat. "All of it." Ilara ignored her, her eyes locked on the man who was her father. She saw the flicker of doubt, the shadow of an old wound. She knew she had one final card to play, one truth that could shatter the walls of his denial. "She made you a promise," Ilara said, her voice dropping to an intense, quiet pitch, "about a locket, a matching one, the one you keep hidden from the world, the one piece of your heart you could never turn into a profitable asset. It's in the safe behind the painting in this office." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the opulent office. Beatrice's face, a moment ago a mask of smug victory, was now a canvas of stark terror. The words had been a key, turning a lock deep inside Arthur Vance, a lock he himself had forgotten existed. His entire empire, his vast portfolio of global assets and carefully managed investments was built on the bedrock of forgetting. And now, this girl, this piece of collateral damage, had just dynamited that foundation. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the large, abstract oil painting that hung on the wall behind his desk, a swirl of dark blues and greys that usually soothed him, a representation of controlled chaos. Now, it just looked like a door. "Arthur, don't be ridiculous." Beatrice's voice was sharp, brittle. "It's a guess, a lucky guess from some file this ambulance chaser dug up. She's trying to manipulate you." But Arthur wasn't listening. He was moving, his steps stiff, automatic, as if pulled by an invisible string. He reached the wall, and his hand, a hand that had signed deals worth billions of dollars, trembled as it lifted the heavy painting from its hook. Behind it, flush with the wall, was the dark grey metal of a high-security safe. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp. Don't you dare give her the satisfaction." He ignored her. His fingers, clumsy for the first time in decades, fumbled with the digital keypad. The sequence of numbers was a muscle memory, a date from a lifetime ago. A soft beep echoed in the room, and the heavy door swung open. The safe was mostly empty, save for a few bearer bonds and a single, velvet-lined box. With a reverence that felt alien in this temple of modern capital, he lifted the box out. He opened it. Inside, resting on faded black velvet, was a silver locket. It was identical to the one he had found on the marble floor of his ballroom. The one that was currently a hard and cold lump in his trouser pocket. The unique 5-petaled flower, his design, seemed to mock him from its engraved surface. Slowly, as if in a dream, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the other locket, the one on the broken chain. He placed it beside its twin in the box, two halves of a whole, two pieces of a life he had convinced himself was over. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was a physical reality. Lying in a box in his hands, it was irrefutable, undeniable, and it crashed down upon him with the force of a tidal wave, sweeping away decades of denial and carefully constructed indifference. The man who measured his life in profit and loss statements was suddenly confronted with a debt he could never repay. "You knew," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look at Ilara or Alistair. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were fixed on his wife. Beatrice's composure finally shattered. The mask of elegance and control dissolved, revealing the raw, venomous greed beneath. "Knew!" she shrieked, her voice rising hysterically. "Of course, I knew. I've known for years. I found a letter from that artist woman tucked away in one of your old books not long after we were married, a pathetic, sentimental letter about her great sacrifice." Her confession poured out, a torrent of poison. "I did what was necessary. Do you have any idea what a scandal like this would have done to us? To the stock price? To Julian's inheritance? Our entire fortune? The patrimonio we built, threatened by some ghost from your past? I made sure she stayed away. I intercepted letters. I arranged for misfortunes. I paid people to keep tabs on her. When she appeared with her pathetic little posters, I had to escalate. I couldn't let her get close enough to destroy everything." Every word was a hammer blow, revealing the true scope of her cruelty. It wasn't just about the flower shop. It had been a systematic, calculated campaign of sabotage spanning years, all to protect a lifestyle, an inheritance, a position of power built on a foundation of lies. Arthur looked at the woman he had shared his life with, and for the first time he saw her clearly. She wasn't his partner. She was the warden of his gilded cage, a ruthless guardian of his wealth who had sacrificed his soul to protect their balance sheet. He closed the velvet box with a soft, final click. He turned to her, his face a mask of stone. "Get out," he said. The words were quiet, but they held the absolute authority of a man who could move markets with a single phone call. "Arthur, you can't be serious," she stammered, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "After everything I've done for this family, and for our son, get out," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, each word a shard of ice. "Contact my lawyer. He will inform you of the terms of your departure. You will not take anything that you did not bring with you into this marriage. Now." Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She saw in his eyes that it was over. The empire she had fought so viciously to protect had just disowned her. With a final, hate-filled glare at Ilara, she turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her sharp footsteps echoing her defeat. A heavy silence descended. Arthur Vance, the billionaire titan, stood in the center of his office, looking utterly lost. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw Lilia's eyes, her resilience, her artist's spirit, the weight of 26 years of lost time, of a life he never knew he had, settled on his shoulders. With a shaking hand, he picked up his desk phone. He didn't look at the number he was dialing. "Cancel it," he said into the receiver, his voice hoarse. "The auction for the Elm Street property, cancel it, permanently." He hung up the phone and sank into his leather chair, the velvet box still clutched in his hands. He had saved her shop, a tiny gesture against a mountain of neglect. But the resolution was not a celebration. There were no joyful tears, no happy reunion. Instead, a profound and heavy silence filled the office, a space so vast it seemed to amplify the chasm between them. This was not a reunion, it was an excavation, the unearthing of a truth buried under decades of lies, ambition, and unimaginable wealth. Arthur Vance, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved global markets, looked small in his oversized chair, diminished by a grief he had never allowed himself to feel. Ilara stood watching him, the diary and the letter still in her hands. She felt no triumph, only a deep, soul-crushing weariness. The anger that had propelled her here had burned away, leaving behind the hollow ache of what could have been. She was the daughter of a billionaire, an heiress to a vast fortune. But in that moment, she had never felt more like the poor girl from the flower shop. Alistair Finch, ever the quiet observer, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Well, perhaps we should go," he murmured, his voice a soft anchor in the swirling emotional storm. Arthur's head snapped up at the movement, his eyes focusing on Ilara as if seeing her for the first time without the filter of denial. "Wait," he said, his voice raspy. He stood, his movement stiff and uncertain. He didn't cross the room. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at her, his gaze tracing the features of her face, searching for the ghost of the woman he had loved. "The locket," he said, gesturing to his pocket. "The one I found. It was yours." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a small, painful acknowledgement. Ilara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The days that followed were a strange, disjointed blur. There were no grand gestures, no tearful apologies. The reconciliation, if it could be called that, began not with words, but with actions. The deed to the flower shop, and the entire building it was housed in, appeared at Alistair's office, transferred to Ilara's name, free and clear. A trust fund was established, containing a sum of money so vast it seemed like a typo, a figure that could have bought and sold entire neighborhoods, but the capital felt cold, a transactional apology from a man who knew the language of money far better than the language of the heart. They began to meet, tentatively at first. Awkward lunches in private dining rooms where the silence was louder than the clinking of silverware. He would ask her about her life, about Martha, his questions formal and stilted. She would answer in short, clipped sentences, unable to bridge the gap of 26 years of absence. He was a stranger with her mother's eyes, a father who existed only in legal documents and stock portfolios. She was a painful reminder of his greatest regret, a living embodiment of a life he had forsaken for the pursuit of his first $1 billion. The victory was real, but it was steeped in sorrow. The blooming stem reopened, its shelves overflowing with vibrant flowers, a beacon of life on a street that was no longer slated for demolition. The community celebrated her as a hero, a David who had faced Goliath and won. But Ilara knew the truth was more complicated. She had saved her shop, but she had lost the simple, uncomplicated identity she had always known. One crisp autumn afternoon, weeks after their confrontation, he called her. "There's a place I need to go," he said, his voice strained. "I was wondering if you would go with me." She knew where he meant. They stood together in silence at her mother's grave, a simple stone marker in a quiet, forgotten corner of a sprawling cemetery. The name Lilia was carved into the granite, weathered by years of sun and rain. For the first time, Ilara was not there alone. Arthur's tailored suit looked out of place among the fallen leaves. He held a large, perfect bouquet of white lilies, while Ilara clutched a small, wild bunch of the same 5-petaled flowers she had always sketched, picked that morning from her own shop. They placed the flowers on the cold stone, their hands brushing for a brief, electric moment. A single tear traced a path down Arthur's weathered cheek. It was the first crack in the billionaire's armor, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him. He didn't wipe it away. "She would have been so proud of you," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed grief. "You have her strength, her heart." Ilara looked from his face to the name on the tombstone and then back to the flowers from her shop. The pain was still there, a permanent part of her story, but for the first time, standing beside the father she had just found, at the grave of the mother she had never known, she felt a new, unfamiliar sensation blooming in the barren spaces of her heart. It was not joy, not yet. It was something quieter, more fragile, and infinitely more precious. It was the first, uncertain glimmer of hope. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. Let us know in the comments what part of Ilara's journey resonated with you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another story of struggle, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. Thank you for watching.